Hello and welcome to Ask GMBN Tech. This is the show where we get to answer your questions. So if you have a question of your own, get in the comments below using the hashtag AskGMBNTech, and hopefully we can feature it on the show. Anyway, on to this week's questions. So the first question this week comes from Jacob, and they ask, "Hi guys, I've recently purchased the new Fox 2021 Fox Transfer Dropper 150mm for my Alchemy Art Cost 27.5. I knew the insertion length wasn't the biggest and did measure to ensure the post would be compatible. Unfortunately, I didn't take into account the added saddle stack height when fully extended. The riding position is slightly too high, about 10 or 20mm too high. Is there any way to possibly lower the saddle height or maybe raise my body position so that my riding position is a bit more comfortable? I don't want to replace the post with the 125mm version as I'd have to wait another 3 months. I also don't want to replace the cranks with the shorter ones as they are fairly expensive." So this is a real tricky one. The first thing you could do is you could experiment by moving the saddle forward on its rails, because you would effectively be reducing the distance between your contact points. So that could be a good way, but it might not necessarily suit you. The other option could be looking at the saddle itself and see if you can get a lower stack one. And the final and most painful one, and something I've done before, is, and I feel like a bit of a hack just saying it, but I've ground off the bottom of a seat post just to account for the bend in a seat tube, which probably could get about 7 or 8mm out of that. But I don't know what the new assembly is like on the bottom of the Foxes. The one that I was using, the one I ground down, it was just kind of relatively cheap replaceable part. Should it have all gone awry, which it didn't. But yes, so don't hacksaw your bike to pieces, but if you do it carefully. But yeah, I would say move it forward on the rails, and apart from that, you're probably going to run out of options quite quickly. I suppose you could maybe, if you wanted to get a bit technical in the old pedals, you could put some washers under your pedals, but that's still only going to be, some washers under your cleats, but that's still only going to be a millimetre or two. So sadly, it's just a tricky situation to be in. The next question comes from Certified Car Nut, and they say, "I recently acquired a 2014 Trek Fuel EX7 29er size large or 19.5. The Geo isn't anything spectacular by modern standards, but it's okay. They're currently on an 80mm stem with 740mm bars. If I put a 40mm stem on it, drop the stem down under the top spacer with 780 or 800 bars, will that have a negative impact on handling? It has a 69-degree head tube angle. I also don't want to impact the reach as it's not overly long at 447. The wheelbase is somewhere around 1160. Well, in the way it's going to affect handling is that bikes generate stability in different ways. So one of which could be stem length, but there's also another geometry dimension called trail. Now you can increase the amount of trail you're running either by running a slacker head tube angle or more offset. But on bikes that do have short stems, they tend to have a slightly higher quantity of trail for one reason or another. You might also find that because you're really reducing your cockpit length, a lot of these modern bikes, like for instance the Polar, yes, it is very slack, and yes, they do run a 63-degree head angle with a 40mm stem. However, they do have a very steep seat tube angle, so even when you're sat down, the bike does balance itself out and it manages to find a lot of grip. What you might find is that your weight is a lot further rearward, and you don't really have the room in the top tube, the effective top tube length, to go slamming the seat forward on its rails to get some grip, which you've lost by putting a very short stem on it. I would say go for a 60 or 70mm stem. That's adequately short for trail riding, and especially when coupled with something like you said isn't overly aggressive, you'll probably find it plays a lot nicer and is a lot stabler. You don't need to be too twitchy on the front end or anything like that. The next question is from Cameron, and they say, "Will adding more volume spacers to my 120mm, 115mm downcountry bike make it feel more efficient like an XC bike by making it harder to go all the way through the travel?" In terms of efficiency wise, it probably won't make that much difference. It's to get a real grip about what you're talking about. The mid-stroke probably will be slightly affected in terms of spring rate, but not vastly. If you did want it to be more efficient, it would either be via compression damping or just increase the spring rate via air pressure. Tuning where that spring rate is, or where that curve is sitting, it probably won't make that much noticeable difference to how the bike pedals, in all honesty. It might make a bit, but probably not too much. A lot of the time, I find that when you make an XC bike very progressive, the issue is, and I mentioned on earlier on, is if the compression tune is too light, then you basically lose a lot of stability in the initial to mid-stroke. And so it's almost like dropping and then catching you as you do hit that ramp up of the spring rate. But it can be quite disconcerting and not all that stable. So yeah, it depends what damper you've got in there and how much compression you're running. But sometimes, especially on rear shocks, when you have quite a short travel bike with the light compression tune, it can be quite disconcerting to ride. But that's just my feeling anyway. I think that volume spacers are great for tuning bottom out. And obviously, in the longer travel applications, I think there is a real case for feel. I think in shorter travel, it's more of a bottom out tuning thing for me. But another YouTube commenter did explain it far better than me in one simple sentence. Mark Betteridge simply replied, "Try it out and experiment." And that would be my advice too. Try it. If it doesn't work and you don't like it, sack it off. No worries. The next question is from Mike. And he said, can you do a video on the difference between a $30 headset versus a $170 headset? I can easily tell the difference between a $500 fork and a $1,000 fork, but what do you get for the extra $140 in a headset? And does the extra dollars make it worth spending more? For instance, does it last 6 times as long? Like everything, there is an element, of course, of diminishing returns, but you're probably going to get something that's made to a better tolerance, which is always a good thing, higher grade parts, and it's going to be smoother. And what I mean by that is when you fit them, they're probably equally smooth, but it's going to stay smoother for longer, and they can do that various ways. You get systems like Cane Creek's Hellbender bottom brackets and headsets which use those completely sealed bearings, which I imagine if you did ride somewhere real gritty and horrible would be an absolute godsend. Similarly, Nukeproof do that treatment on the surface of the bearings to inhibit all kinds of corrosion, which is definitely a good thing. It's funny, when I used to work on races, the team I worked for didn't have a headset sponsor, so we could run whatever headsets we wanted to. And on the the more entry-level bearings, because we would obviously have the headset fitted by the bearing separately, the riders were getting 1 day out of a lower headset bearing. And you think that and you think, no, something must have been wrong. It wasn't, it's just they ride that hard. However, when we went to the higher end bearings, they got a lot more life out of them. So how much difference that makes for your average punter, I don't know. For me, I probably wouldn't be that picky, but if you're riding really hard, all those tolerances really do add up to reduce any play whatsoever. But it's like I said, it is diminishing returns though, but it definitely is something to be said for very nice componentry. The next question is from Games123 Nope, and he said, are Fox shocks bushings compatible with Marzocchi shocks? Yes, we'll both use 12.7mm bushes, and that's the measurement really. You can get some that are 12mm and then some go a bit larger. I think there was a Cane Creek standard creeping around for a while, almost 14mm or something like that. But most shocks now are actually on the 12.7. So yeah, should be no worries there, especially since in the last couple of years, Fox have owned Marzocchi. So I would assume they'd all want that in a row. Next question is from Will, and they say, I race downhill, but I really struggle with arm pump. I've tried my brakes, all different angles, the grips I'm using, but he's really helped. Please, I'm struggling. It's difficult. Some people do struggle with arm pump, just habitually, and that is the case. I'm not saying this is the case with you. I would say, it sounds like you looked at brakes, but also, the roll of your bars, the style of your bars, the back sweep of your bars, and also, riding technique probably, it does have a little bit to do with that whole heavy feet, light hands. Now I know that's really, really hard when you're cracking on a downhill run, but it might help, though I'm not saying it does. I think if you race downhill, you probably already kind of approach that sort of thing. I would say another thing that would help would be brakes, making sure your brakes are working as powerfully as they could be. And that can even be what pads you're using. You know, I find on some systems, the resins they fade so much, the organic pads do, that I get hand pump. Similarly, there are some sintered pads where the initial bite is so poor that I also find fatigue issues. Final bit I would say is to look at some stretching, you know, the carpal tunnel, etc. Even icing after riding might help you indeed. If this does persist, go and see your doctor or a physiotherapist. There is some things, like I said, that I've had friends that have had it habitually, like that's just how their body is, sadly, and they've had to have operations to relieve chronic arm pump. You know, and you do hear about that on the downhill circuit. So I'm not saying that is the case. I'm not a medical professional, but I would suggest, if this persists, seeing a medical professional, and because they'll be able to tell you a lot more than I can. The last question is from Lucas Stevens, and he says, could you tell me some of the possible ways rim dents are caused so that I could avoid them in the future? As I have a few, should I replace the rim? I run tubes, so will it lead to more pinch flats? Well, it's basically from just hitting things, and that's it. You know, this can be a combination of pressure, rim width, or riding style, or the sidewall of your tyre, how thick that is, of course. You can use inserts. I tend to run an insert in the back almost all the time, especially I think on your short travel trail bikes that have very progressive geometry. They're so capable now, and you can hit stuff so hard. But a combination of them being shorter travel and all that comes with that is that they often are quite firm in terms of their how the suspension feels. So on a downhill bike, you just plow through it without noticing it. But on a 130, 140 mile trail bike, you might find that the bike is so capable, it ends up punishing the tyres. Does it really affect things? Yeah, it does. You know, if you're dinging rims all the time, it's not a good thing. Now, some people, myself included, would probably argue that a rim is a consumable part, sadly, especially on the back, and you shouldn't expect it to go forever, but you do want to be maximising that life. So I would suggest running higher pressure, you say you're still in tubes, and if the problem really persists, maybe look at going tubeless with an insert, and you'll be amazed at how quiet the bike sounds as much as anything. And it's really, really nice just being able to go into some rocks, dip your heels, and know you're going to come out the other side, which is something you take for granted until it happens to you a lot. But that's it for this week's Ask GMBN Tech. Thank you very much for watching. Now, please don't forget to like the video, and if you would consider subscribing, it really helps the channel. Thanks guys, and we'll see you next time.